Welcome. This is part 4 of our lecture, Blitz through the Ancient Near East. We're going to look at the Middle Bronze Age, and it's during this age that we're actually going to see the beginnings of Israel and its intersection with ancient Near Eastern history. And the Bronze Age, again, runs roughly from 2200, 2000, down to 1550. Now, in Mesopotamia, after the fall of the Akkadians, we have the rise of a relatively obscure dynasty. This is the Ur III dynasty, and what this refers to is the actual level at which in the tell at Ur, it refers to the stratigraphy. So there's no name really given to the people here, but they're known as the Ur III dynasty, and this is potentially the place out of which later Abraham would have moved. There were lots of migrations during this period in ancient Near Eastern history, and the migration of Terah and his family, his sons Abram and his nephew Lot, as they moved out of Ur towards the Promised Land, ultimately stopping in Haran. Remember, it's in Haran that Abram gets his decisive call to go to the Promised Land. We also see the rise of the city of Babylon. It first becomes known and is founded during the Middle Bronze Age. Its most significant early leader was a man named Hammurabi or Hammurabi. Sometimes you'll see P's and B's flip in some of these spellings. He's approximately 1750. He's most well known for his law code that has some parallels with some of the laws in, say, the Pentateuch. An important piece of background data for understanding the laws of Israel. Now, late in the period, the Hittites also become prominent. The Hittites are a people group. Most of us remember the Hittites mostly by the reference Uriah the Hittite. That was Bathsheba's husband's name. But the Hittites were a people group that lived in what would be modern-day Turkey. And late in the Middle Bronze period, they were strong enough they were actually able to launch an invasion from outside that goes all the way to Babylon and destroys Babylon. Now, Egypt during the Middle Bronze Age, we see a couple of periods. First, there's the first intermediate period. All of the intermediate periods mean, and again, it never fails to amaze me, the imagination of historians come up with really engaging titles for things. So the intermediate period, how'd you like to live during that time? But anyway, all that really refers to in Egyptian history is this is a 200-year period where there's no one pharaoh that unifies all of Egypt. So life still went on, but there was there were smaller competing centralized governments rather than one pharaoh who was able to claim to control all of Egypt at that time. Then there was a 200-year period known as the Middle Kingdom when there is one pharaoh. We're not going to say anything about the Middle Kingdom. If you're interested, you can check into that further on yourself. But the time period during the Middle Bronze that we're really interested in is actually the second intermediate period, because it's during the second intermediate period that something important happens. Egypt is invaded by outsiders from Palestine, persons that they called the Hyksos. These would be like the shepherd princes. It looks as though Egypt is taken over by adventurers, strongmen, warriors who come down from Syria, Palestine, invade Egypt, and they set up a capital in the Delta region. That's the northern part of Egypt up along the Mediterranean, the Delta region. They set up a capital of Avaris, and they actually rule Egypt from a time. So Egypt is dominated by foreigners. And this looks as though it's a plausible period into understanding how it is that Israel was able to peaceably migrate down into Egypt, and why it's perhaps later pharaohs would not have remembered Joseph. So the whole story of Joseph and his brothers and moving his father Jacob into Egypt, and their really warm welcoming of Jacob and his family into Egypt could best be understood against the background of the Hyksos controlling Egypt. Now, what was going on in Syria-Palestine? Well, if the Syria-Palestine was strong enough to send armies down to take over Egypt, we know that that was a time of strength for this area. And if you do, the archaeology shows that there were really strong, heavily fortified cities during this time period. So to sum things up, in the Middle Bronze period, Israel enters the picture. This is going to be the time period of Israel's ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives and their children and their family. It's when Israel comes into the picture. Again, there's no hard or firm evidence of the individuals existing, but the way that the Bible, the book of Genesis, describes Israel's ancestors does fit into the broad contours of what we know about the time period. We know the Hebrews make it into Egypt during the Middle Bronze period, and there's a city was discovered called Nuzi. It's a mid-2nd century city from this time, and Nuzi is one of the places where there were some documents discovered that have been able to be translated, and the Nuzi documents give us some parallels. So, for example, the wife's sister, the fact that Abram called his wife his sister, the levirate form of marriage where if a brother's dies, another brother takes his wife as his own, has children with her. That's levirate marriage. The freedom to give blessing to any child. In other words, some of the customs and cultural things that we see in the Genesis narratives have parallels with Nuzi. That doesn't demonstrate that the Genesis narratives can be dated to the Middle Bronze Age, but what it does show is that it's plausible that they could be, and that what the book of Genesis says about the life of Israel's ancestors does at least fit in broad contours into the Middle Bronze Age, and that's important for understanding and reconstructing history.